Okay, I think, you know what, it's 3 minutes past. I see people are joining us still, but I will get going. If you wouldn't mind just to move to the next slide, thank you. So those of you not familiar, if you have any technical issues, you can reach out to us. And you can, of course, submit questions through the Q&A function as we go along. But if you'd really like to make a point as well, you're welcome to raise your hand and we can open up access for your audio so you can input to this particular session. So I think our numbers are still climbing, but maybe we should get going. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to this. This is the last in a series of webinars that we will be doing under a project known as Climate and Sustainable Investment. I think what's interesting about the project Climate and Sustainable Investment is firstly, it's a partnership between 3 organizations. So it's a partnership between Just Share, the NBI, the organization I work for, the National Business Initiative, and WWF. But it's very much focused on the investment opportunities we see in the South African landscape related to climate change mitigation primarily, but also an element of climate change adaptation. And we think that's kind of unusual and interesting because it really starts to think about how we turn the low carbon economy into an investment opportunity and how that is already happening. Okay, I can still see we obviously certainly got more people joining us. I think we'll have well over 100 people with today's session as well. So my name is Alex McNamara. I'm the head of operations at the NBI, having been involved in the environmental space for probably 15 years now. The theme for today's session is drawing on our work on the electricity sector. So you might have joined us for some of our great webinars. We had one on the agricultural sector that was led by WWF a few months ago. And very recently, we also had our transport sector study, which was launched through this project, which was a really, really engaging conversation as well. So the last webinar focuses on electricity, and it introduces some of the findings of a report that we've recently produced, but really focuses on a panel discussion with the financial sector around investing in renewable energy, as you would have seen from the invitation, right? So I'll do a quick introduction. I'll talk you through some of our findings of our work that we've been doing recently, which really is a synthesis of work that's out there in the domain or in the South African market at the moment. And then we'll move straight to our panel discussion and polling as well. So good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. It's now effectively gone, I think, 10:05. A reminder, if you've just joined, that you're welcome to tweet and use the hashtags and handles throughout this seminar. The session is being recorded, and if you have any tech issues, you're welcome to let us know. You can submit questions throughout the process through the Q&A function. And you can also raise your hand if you really like to make a specific point. So I think let's get going. So in terms of my welcome, I have to say that I'm not in the Drakensberg. I'm actually in Cape Town, running a Zoom meeting out of a hotel room, which is a first for me. So I apologize for any technical difficulties in advance. But the reason why I'm in Cape Town is because we are here to meet with the city of Cape Town about energy, and in particular, change in the energy system, the opportunities in the energy system. So I think that it's highly fortuitous that I'm here because it speaks to what is exactly happening in the national electricity sector at the moment. The other little tidbit I would share is that I was at breakfast this morning at the hotel, and Andrew de Ruyter was at breakfast this morning, the CEO of Eskom, who I'm sure many of you know is a CEO champion of the NBI's work on thinking about climate pathways for the South African economy. And of course, that includes reports that focus very heavily on the rollout of renewable energy in our country, for example, on a large scale. So I took that as a great sign that I was in the right place, that Andre was in the hotel. I think it was very serendipitous. So what we're going to focus on now is very quickly, I'm going to just take you through some very brief findings from the report we've just released on our website. And then we will break into our Q&A session as well. So just give me a moment. And full screen. Come on. Thank you. Sorry. So as I mentioned, Climate and Sustainable Investment is a project that is a partnership between NBI, Just Share, and WWF. And we titled today's webinar towards unprecedented changes in the South African power sector. And we will be asking your thoughts on how that might occur and when it might occur as well. But I think the backdrop for this is the work we've been doing as a partnership on this project is really to try and synthesize what is out there in the South African domain around electricity. And we're therefore very pleased to obviously release our most recent report. It's available on the website you can see below you, sustainablefinance.org.za. It's got quite a long title. It's Climate Change, Investment and Finance Opportunities in the South African Electricity Sector. I do also want at the outset to thank Dave Collins for his substantial support and assistance in drafting this report. And to say, I think what is important about this document is that it is a synthesis of a number of studies. So it draws heavily on, for example, the NBI, BCG, BUSA work on the power sector, but it also looks at McKinsey. It also looks at UCT's Energy Systems Group research as well, and the Meridian Economics pieces as well. So it's a synthesis of really the state of play of thinking around the South African electricity sector at present in the economy. I think for those of us on this call, there's the key messages will be things that you will be familiar with. I would imagine there's obviously a lot more detail in the report itself, but we thought we should really just focus on a few key messages. Just before, given this is our last webinar, as I mentioned, under this particular project, I thought for those of you less familiar, I should also remind you that this work does form part of a broader set of resources and documents that we have produced, focusing on the role of the financial sector in unlocking investment in the low carbon economy. So for those of you who joined sort of on the hour, a reminder that we've looked previously at the agricultural sector, the transport sector, and now also the electricity sector. But what you see in front of you are just some of the resources we produced under this particular project. So for example, at sustainablefinance.org.za, you'll find a website and resource hub, lots of podcasts, videos, and basically everything you can see on screen is available on that website as well. So there's a resource library of external resources, plus the stuff that we ourselves have produced. You'll find some interesting stuff on investment opportunities in agriculture, transport, and electricity, as mentioned. I think our opinion pieces are also very useful. I will refer to the opinion piece by Anton Eberhardt quite a few times in this call as well, given it focuses specifically on the financing of our transmission infrastructure in the country, a very topical issue. And then I think the video we produced, it's a professionally developed video, but I think if you were looking for a video you could present to people as a kind of introduction to climate change and why it's important, why it's of relevance to the financial sector, I think the video on our site is certainly a very useful place to start if you're interested in that kind of area. So yeah, that is just to give you a flavor of some of the work that's available to you if you're of interest. If we now quickly move into the actual report itself, and the findings of our electricity sector report, clearly there's, we all know, I think there's this inexorable move to a low carbon or net zero economy globally, the kinds of targets that are being set internationally and the focus that has been placed there. And of course, critically, as I think we were aware, that we have to play our role. We have to play a role. That is from an economic competitiveness perspective, from a balance of payments and trade perspective. And I think, as South Africans, we're very familiar and in a way caught up with our own story and our own history, which is very, very complex and difficult in some ways. But I guess you also have to remember that, the rest of the world is not that interested in, I guess, our story, if I can put it that way. They will focus on the meta trends, and we must focus on the meta trends. And one of the great trends, I think, is this move, obviously, to decarbonize, including things like the deployment of renewable energy. I don't think that, certainly in the time that I've worked in the sector, I think the impetus now from all sides, and I think obviously working with business, the kind of force of momentum from business at the moment that we're seeing around energy, around renewable energy, for example, low carbon development, is the greatest it's ever been. I referenced the CEO champions that have driven a lot of the NBI's work over the last 2 years. A really credible and powerful grouping of companies saying we have to achieve a low carbon future, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's for our own economic and financial competitiveness. And of course, speaking to an elite audience, I don't think I need to remind you that electricity is effectively the prime sector for decarbonization. One of the other great things is that that not only is decarbonizing electricity going to be make sense from a carbon emission perspective, we're going to get huge bang for our buck there, but the economics of renewable energy and the economics of decarbonizing the power sector are just too favorable. And that's one of the reasons, that it's just so beautifully primed for action and effort. And of course, as we know, if we decarbonize our power sector, we leave space for many other sectors to maintain or to grow, even in some cases, and maintain their own economic pathway. And then lastly, as I say, for me, these are probably self-evident truths now, but I think there's something important in the fact that they are probably, for most people at least, that what I'm talking to you about is regarded as self-evident truths, whereas 4 or 5 years ago, it would still be very much up for debate. Our fourth sort of major message is that there are significant opportunities for investment in renewable energy, that from a technical feasibility, from an economic and financial feasibility, renewable energy is the most cost competitive way to achieve net zero emissions. There's a lot more in the report about other options and areas of uncertainty. If you're thinking about batteries, if you're thinking about balancing the power grid with other options like diesel and gas, if you're interested, obviously go into the report and have a look. But if we just focus on a core message that, for us comes out, and it's mirrored in, recent work that's happening across the country, is that really we are ready to install renewable energy at a significant pace. You would have heard of between 5 and 6 gigawatts per annum just for the power sector. Significant increases above what we have already, and really ramping up to at least 150 gigawatts of solar and wind by 2050. I can tell you that, if we want to go electric vehicles, green hydrogen, the feeling is that we need about 500 gigawatts of renewable energy on the grid by 2050. It may seem like quite a staggering figure, but I think we should be reminded that when we speak to investors, they remind us that South Africa has got some of the best renewable energy resources in the world. We haven't even spoken about offshore wind yet, because the onshore wind is great. Obviously, solar speaks for itself. And despite some of the stop-start in our markets, there is such appetite to invest in our country, partly because of the very great renewable energy resources that we have at our disposal, and the fact that many of these projects, of course, will be commercially viable. And I guess our final key message is around the financial sector. What kinds of instruments will support different technologies? Clearly, we think, when it comes to renewable energy, it's a much more mature market, but there are other things down the road in the electricity sector that may well require different instruments and different products to be realized and to achieve our goals. So this is just a very brief synopsis of, I think, just to set the scene for the conversation we're going to have in a few minutes' time. For me, the take-home message is similar to what was released fairly recently by the NBI, that it all hinges on renewables, that effectively lots of our low-carbon development hinges, never mind, I guess, energy security, etc., hinges on renewable energy. And that there are definitely changes afoot. Talking to today's webinar, you might have seen the announcement that Eskom is signing, I think it's 4 renewable energy projects leased on its land. That announcement made a few days ago. That there are definitely changes happening within the sector at the moment. So with that, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. And I will move over very quickly to our panel discussion. Just give me 1 second. Thank you. And I could ask maybe if our panelists wouldn't mind to just switch on their videos, that would be fantastic. Just to say that, unfortunately, Robert Lewinson, literally this morning has fallen ill. So he's unable to join us, unfortunately. But we're very lucky that Rachel Metsi-Moletsani, the head of environment for the NBI, has been very kindly, graciously joining us as a last-minute replacement for Robert, obviously having worked in the sector for a very, very long time herself as well. So good morning, panelists, and I'll just briefly introduce our panel, if you don't mind. So firstly, we have Arvana Singh. She's the head of Sustainable Finance Solutions at Nedbank. Then we have Pranisha Sahadeo, who is the senior transactor for infrastructure sector solutions at Rand Merchant Bank. And then, as I mentioned, Rachel Metsi-Moletsani, the head of environment at the NBI. So I think what's nice is we've got 2 sort of financial gurus on the call with us. So we will draw on your expertise substantially, if you don't mind. But thank you very much. And maybe I'll start with you, Arvana. I mean, maybe we can just, you could take us through. I mean, I'm sure in your role, you guys are have already been supporting the renewable energy market in the country quite substantially. Maybe you could just take us through what you guys how you're already investing in renewable energy in the country at different scales. So maybe at a commercial level, if you can, at an industrial level, and I guess at a utility scale. What is the current lay of the land, if I could put it that way? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Alex, and good morning to everyone. I think, importantly, renewable energy is impacting across the spectrum right now, whether that be in the retail space or the wholesale space, all the way from your retail consumer right up to your corporate and industrial and independent power producer. And the generation needs for each of these segments are very different, and the financial profiles of each of these segments are different. And therefore, it's really important to be able to provide bespoke financing solutions for each of these various needs. Now, at Nedbank as a whole, we've launched various financing products. Particularly in our retail space, we have the solar financing product, which we launched this year, which ultimately enables access to individual homeowners to effectively finance a solar installation on their home in a similar manner as to how they would finance a car. So it does allow them, it does allow easier access to actually finance, which avoids some of the upfront costs of solar financing, which can be quite significant for the average consumer. And that's all the way down at the retail space. But if we move more towards the corporate and the industrial and commercial space, we've played a very active role in that space through our energy finance team in particular, where we financed a large number of renewable energy projects under the Independent Power Producer Program. And we're also seeing a lot more activity in the commercial and industrial embedded generation space. And this is largely driven by the fact that corporate South Africa is looking to switch towards renewable energy sources. And ultimately, it's around the objective of energy security, as well as the cost-benefit analysis associated with transitioning to this. And importantly, it's also around climate change. There's a massive need to actually transition our economies, and we spend a lot of time with clients actually having these sustainability conversations and also driving that awareness in terms of the impact that you can have, which is manifold, especially in the context of South Africa right now, where energy security, and in fact globally, energy security and energy affordability, in addition to climate change, are key issues to tackle.
Thank you so much, Ivana. Pranisha, your thoughts on the financing of renewables from an R&B perspective?
Sure. So no, thanks, and good morning to everybody. I think from an R&B perspective, we truly believe that there really is a large amount of capital available for deployment into renewable energy projects, both on the government-run program, which is on the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program, and also in the C&I space as well. I think Ivana has mentioned, the retail banking sector has really come to the party in terms of partnering with rooftop installers and adding the costs onto your home loan just to make it a little bit more affordable for consumers, to fulfill their renewable energy needs. I think also what's quite important to note is that evidence of the fact that capital is largely available is the bank's competitiveness in the recent REIP rounds and also in the C&I space. I think another important point to mention is that there were recent regulation changes to Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act, which changes the proportion of or the percentage that they are able to invest in infrastructure assets broadly, which also covers the power sector. So I think this change is very, very positive for the country and will serve to crowd in a lot of investors that we wouldn't have typically seen in the past investing into renewable energy projects.
That's great to hear. And Pranisha, maybe I'll stay with you. Do you see changes happening in the electricity sector? Put it this way, do you think that the title of this webinar is too optimistic, or do you think that it's actually, we are going to see unprecedented changes in the near future?
No, I mean, I think we definitely are going to see. I mean, President made a recent announcement of the 100 megawatt lifting of the generation license, which is hugely positive. We're also seeing the emergence of energy traders in the market, which, I mean, historically, I think we've seen in the European context. We've seen the emergence of energy exchanges as well, which is quite common in more developed, areas of the world. And ultimately, what this serves to do is it provides a common marketplace for energy sellers and energy buyers to purchase electricity on a wholesale basis. So that's ultimately what we would like to see. And I really do believe the market is headed there. I guess it's just a question of, how short-term or long-term that's expected to happen in the South African context. But I mean, I definitely, from an RMB perspective, we definitely are seeing a liberalization of the markets. Besides bilateral PPAs being entered into between corporates and independent power producers, we are seeing, as I've mentioned, the emergence of these energy traders, which is very positive.
Great, thank you so much. Rachel Metsi, do you agree? I mean, what are your thoughts on the changes you see or envisage in the electricity sector? I mean, I guess drawing on quite extensive work we've done on the power sector.
Thanks, Alex, and good morning to everyone. I think, much has already been said. So even the title of the webinar is something that I do agree with. We've seen huge shifts in how the South African energy market is structured, but there's still a lot that's happening. So there's still a lot that's going to be emerging, and not exactly sure how that will finally play out, where there's a degree of uncertainty in that space. But what is clear is that we've come a long way. We've shifted very much, and are seeming to embrace, the opportunity, the potential that we have to address our energy security issues at the moment, as well as the climate benefits that arise from a resource that is so abundant and one, we're so well positioned. So I definitely agree that there's a big shift and a big welcome shift that we see. I think what's important is to also be quite deliberate or mindful of the need to be able to include a whole range of stakeholders in this market. You mentioned a little bit of the work that we've been doing on the just transition pathways earlier on, and we had released a report looking at the power sector in particular. And we're mentioning that we anticipate up to 6 to 12 gigawatts of renewables coming online on an annual basis to decarbonize the power sector, but also to enable us as a country to see some of these opportunities in the green hydrogen space as well as others. So I think we need to be a bit more deliberate and a bit more proactive in how we are shaping and positioning different actors to be able to contribute to this massive amount of renewables that we need to see coming online over the next few decades. And I'm quite heartened to hear from colleagues on the line just mentioning some of the products that are already targeting the commercial and industrial sector, but also the residential sector as well.
Thanks so much, Rachel Metsi. I'd be quite interested in your thoughts on the one question that's been asked in the chat about, do we think that we have a chance to end load shedding by 2024? I think there'll be quite a few skeptics around that, but maybe I'll come back to you on that one later if you want.
No, so I'm optimistic. I think some of the things that we've heard, particularly led by the private sector in being able to generate their own electricity, some large scale projects are currently on the pipeline. And if so, I definitely think we'd be able to resolve or at least reduce it substantially.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that takes us
to hope so.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think you're right. The corporates of Africa and the movements by the private sector are the kind of, I don't want to say the dark horse, that's the wrong phrase, but if you know what I mean, like it's the thing that could really shift things in addition to what's already happening. And maybe Ivana, that takes me to you, if you don't mind. I mean, your thoughts on how the power sector may evolve, and going back to the corporate South Africa sector, what advice would you have for corporates that want to invest in renewable energy as part of this journey that we're embarking on?
Sure, thanks. I do think very importantly is to understand the objectives when you're investing in renewable energy. So are you doing it for energy security? Are you doing it for cost savings? Or what is the main driver behind this? And once you're clear on your objective, the financial decision as to whether to invest in renewable energy or not becomes a little more guided, because maybe it's not only about the direct savings, but it's also about the fact that you've got the security and you avoiding opportunity costs that may come with not having that backup. I think very important is to actually understand the technology. We've got wheeling, we have on-site installation, you can procure, there's batteries, there's a number of different permutations and combinations, and very important to understand the tech in order to ensure that your objectives for your company and keeping your company operations is being met. There are quite a few instances, especially if you're wheeling over an ESCOM infrastructure in a load shedding environment, which may not necessarily guarantee you energy supply. So very important to speak to players, make sure you do your homework there. Also to partner with experienced players in the space, I think is going to be important. Ensuring that you also keep up not just with the tech, but also I think partnering with financing partners who've been in the space and have seen this evolution that can help assist you on that journey would be important. In terms of where I see this going with corporate South Africa, it's certainly important to start, first of all, transitioning their operations in terms of supplying that from an electricity point of view, but also very important if you look at the net zero commitments that are being made. And this is really to ensure that, and to the points that you made earlier, Alex, it's around being competitive from a trade perspective. And in order to do that, the carbon footprint of your activities from a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 perspective, need to be coming down. And in order to do that, powering or securing electricity is a big source of that. And then moving forward from that, it's really around your supply chains and taking that a step further in terms of reducing scope 3 emissions as well. So I think there will be quite a big push as we see a lot of corporates making these commitments on the journey to net zero 2030 or 2050, and this is across sectors, but now it's really around the action behind that. And I think very similarly in the independent power producer and what we need to do as a country is we need to continue to procure energy. We need to maintain confidence, we need to sustain confidence, the capital is there, the funding is there, but let's ensure that we're acting fast enough to ensure that we continue to remain competitive in the space.
Thanks so much, Alvana. And just as you were chatting, I had a quick look at the chat just to see if there were any useful questions. I mean, there was a question that went back, I guess, to my presentation. I think this is probably more for yourself, Retumetsi, but I'll come back to you now, Alvana. Retumetsi, there's a question about the 150 gigawatts of solar PV and wind. I mean, that's also referenced in other studies, for example. I mean, maybe you could answer the question, is that 150 gigawatts, or, is that aspirational to 2050? Or is that actually based on power sector modeling, etc.? Maybe you could just answer that question. I think let's clarify that goal that we have in place, that minimum goal we have in place.
Yeah, so it's based on modeling. So working with our technical partners, BCG, and a whole range of other stakeholders, including I think key players in the power sector. We did quite extensive modeling and also understood, the degree to which a kind of cyclic coupling would also have implications on the amount of renewables we needed. So it's definitely based on modeling, and perhaps just to say to the person, I'll post in the chat and the link to the report. It's quite detailed in terms of the approach that we took, and starts to expand on that number in terms of how we're thinking and the rollout over the next 3 decades or so.
Brilliant. Thanks, Retumetsi. And thanks also for the comments in the chat that also spoke to that as well. So, but of course, the big constraint to, well, what's certainly argued is the main actually issue, the bigger constraint to the rollout of at least that 150 gigawatts of power is the transmission network. You may have seen, it's gathered more attention more recently that, we built our transmission networks, our power lines for Mpumalanga and for the transfer of coal-based electricity from Mpumalanga to the rest of the country, essentially. and obviously primarily through to Gauteng, the Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal. But as it turns out, most of our solar electricity or solar potential resides in the Northern Cape. Most of our wind is in the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. And if you look at Eskom's latest assessment of the grid, they cannot add new power onto the grid from the Northern Cape. And the Western Cape is, I think, 1.5 gigawatts of power could be added, which is really nothing. And the Eastern Cape not that far off from that as well. So Ivana, I wonder if I could come back to you. It's a tricky issue. How do we also enable the grid so that we also enable the rollout of renewable energy? Have you guys thought about this kind of thing? Have you been following it? Any thoughts on how we're going to finance the transmission upgrades we definitely need?
Yes, so capacity is definitely a constraint, and I think that's a very important factor in this equation. And what we do find is that, again, if you don't connect to the grid fast enough, you could potentially come into a situation where it gets more expensive to start connecting to the grid for things like RE, etc. So in order to avoid that rush, very importantly, it's Eskom needing to be restructured. And we all understand that in order to finance this grid expansion, we need to ensure that we've got the entity and the restructure bedded down so that funding can go into those particular entities, depending on where the restructure lands. So that has been a little bit of, in limbo at the moment until there's some finality, but there are other ways you could do it in terms of off-balance sheet project financing if the tariffs are structured in a manner that will enable the project to be financed as a carve-out out of the Eskom balance sheet itself. So there's definitely ways in which we can get creative and look at financing it to make it bankable. But I think it's very important that this restructure situation is bedded down and it's understood how that entity is going to look to enable that to continue. But I think also to the point Pranisha made earlier around liberalization and energy exchanges as well, I think that can also bring a very new dimension to this equation in terms of other markets and procuring electricity from various places.
Maybe I could just follow up. You mentioned off-balance sheet financing. Was that for Eskom specifically, so that it's kind of separated out in terms of the way that they finance the grid? Did I understand that correctly? Is that what you're mentioning?
Yeah, so typically we can either provide financing against a company's balance sheet, whether that's a corporate or whether that's a public entity, or we can do it outside a corporate balance sheet, which is really ring-fenced to the project itself. So you have a project financing arrangement, and ultimately underneath that, there has to be certain income streams that will come through, but that could be structured in the form of tariffs or offtake agreements, which then allows you an independent entity, which still will need to stack up from a credit perspective, but it's removed from the balance sheet exposure, and if there's large amounts of debt, if the balance sheet cannot sustain anymore, then there's potentially a structure you could look at.
Sure, thank you. Pranisha, maybe I'll come to you on this topic. I mean, just to say, I mean, we asked this question of Anton Eberhardt, and what do you think how we could finance transmission upgrades? And essentially he said, well, one could look at the public-private partnership route. You could think about possibly even down the road setting up almost like concessions where the private sector, I guess, would upgrade and maintain certain transmission network upgrades and networks. Possibly difficult to achieve, but that was one option. And then he also made reference to the formation of the National Transmission Company. If you have any thoughts on either of those, you're welcome to. But any thoughts on how we're going to finance the transmission upgrades, which we're certainly going to need over the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very challenging because, I mean, we have seen estimates of Eskom needing anywhere between 130 to 180 billion worth of on-balance sheet debt. And as it stands, it's quite difficult for Eskom to raise, that kind of funding on balance sheet. So I think it is definitely a good idea, a possible alternative whereby we could look at a concession type of structure, but one would need to gain clarity around the separation of the roles of Eskom first. So we would need a lot of clarity around that before we were to investigate that. What I am aware is that Eskom is due to have or give the general public a presentation on their plan around the upgrades of the transmission and distribution infrastructure. I think it's due to occur on the 27th of October. So I think that really is going to be, critical conversation for Eskom and the public and the funding community at large, in order to kind of work together and determine, okay, where to from here, and how can we facilitate the funding of these transmission and distribution infrastructure in order to deliver the renewable energy that the country needs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as an aside, one thing I've noted, I mean, I think you kind of referenced it as well. I mean, the formation, for example, of the independent system market operator could be an enabler. The national transmission company, once will form, could be an enabler. I mean, I've heard, I mean, the sense is that the national transmission company could in itself become would be its own entity, and actually could have its own, develop its own sort of credit history and its own, well, basically its own sort of financial status, and therefore could probably, could borrow money, etc. Because, obviously Eskom's financially constrained at this moment. Is that your sense as well, or was that not something that you can really comment on?
No, I mean, I think that could be true. It would also depend on the capitalization of this entity. So who, would be willing to put in additional funds to capitalize the entity, therefore making it a little bit easier for bank funding to go in this specific entity. So I think, yes, that definitely would definitely be the case. I think what's quite important for Eskom to reveal to everybody, and I'm sure this will be discussed on the 27th of October meeting, is what is their plans? Because, I mean, we all know there's 101 substations that need to be upgraded. There's 8,000 kilometers of transmission lines. I mean, it just seems monstrous at this point in time. So just in terms of, what their plan is from a prioritization point of view. Ultimately, what we would like to see is prioritization being given to the Northern Cape, obviously, because grid capacity has been completely tied up there. And we know that the Western Cape is next to go in terms of grid capacity once the bid window 5 and the bid window 6 projects have been awarded.
Thanks so much. Totally agree. Rachel, any thoughts from your side on the grid? I mean, and the work that you've been doing and thinking through about this particular topic?
Thanks, Alex. I mean, I think it's been really insightful just listening to the other speakers as well. So, really grateful for those inputs. Even in the work that we had discussed kind of a little bit previously, the role of the grid is really critical to enable that rollout of renewables that we want to see. And I've seen a few of the points made a couple of times actually in the chat, also speaking about beyond this expansion where we think the greatest capacity of renewables will be required, and mention of Northern Cape and Western Cape. And I saw a comment as well from, I think it's Deborah, just also acknowledging that there's an opportunity to realize connections, perhaps not in the most optimal areas relative to the resource that we have, but maybe that Eskom initiative around inviting the private sector and being able to connect to the grid, so where there is connectivity available. I mean, this is a multifaceted approach, and it's speaking to the structure of the market, and I think the recognition and appreciation that you will have different actors. You will definitely need to expand the grid, but also to modernize it. And the point made in the chat around making sure that it's a smart grid, so being able to enable the digital component of the grid is also something that is key, particularly when we want to see more renewables and embedded generation and kind of different scales of renewables being included in the grid. So I think that's probably the one other thing that I'd like to add to what has already been mentioned, this idea of using the opportunity of having to expand the grid for our needs, to enable us to be competitive, also as an opportunity to really modernize and to position ourselves going forward. So I think that's a key point that we also need to recognize in this discussion: expansion, but also this digital component as well.
Yeah, we haven't really touched on that. Thank you for that as well. I mean, at the risk of sounding naive, I think I might have a go, Richard, at your question around liberalization and extent thereof. I mean, I obviously raised the idea, for example, of public-private partnerships and concessions around the grid, which I think the fundamental premise of any formal contracted long-term PPP in our country is that their ownership would always remain with the public sector. I think about the work we've done in other areas of infrastructure. I think that is essentially it would be a given. I think it's, if I think about concessions that operate in the country, there are some, for example, on water, and I don't think that they would be that different in the power sector necessarily, in that under a concession, you would be, private party would basically be under a performance contract, but deciding for the long term. They would not have any ownership, but they would be able to collect revenues, and they would be able to maintain assets and operate assets, essentially. I cannot see us going any further than that route, certainly under any liberalization approach. And we may well, that would probably be the most extreme end of the cycle. Obviously, in many cases, we would look just to attract private finance into public sector infrastructure development. But that, I think that's probably as far as it would go. But I must confess that I've looked at this more in the water infrastructure space. I would also be interested maybe if we touch on the sort of energy trading that's going on, which is obviously related. So yeah, I mean, maybe you're welcome to comment, Richard, in the chat if you feel that more conversation is needed on that. Ivana, if I may come to you now again, your thoughts on what we need to do to sort of unlock this renewable energy future. What are the key next steps? And you obviously, you mentioned the retail sector, but you could obviously comment, whether it be at an industrial level, a retail sector level, or even at an IPP level as well.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think we need to be very forward-looking and continue to encourage this adoption of renewable energy. And one of the products we actually use to do that is that of sustainability-linked loans, which you may have heard of, which is one of the fastest growing products at the moment for us as well as globally. And effectively, what this financing instrument does is we embed sustainability performance targets on a forward-looking basis. And we spend a lot of time with the sustainability teams and treasury teams at corporates to effectively get a commitment in to actually increase the share of renewable energy as a percentage of total electricity consumption, for example. And then we measure that over the period of the financing, whether that's 12 months from now, 24 months from now. And potentially there's an incentive that can be effectively, that can accrue to the borrower, or there's a penalty if they don't meet that target. So I think it's all about, and this is really an instrument which the banks have been stimulating. We've really been pushing this with our clients, all in the spirit of moving this transition forward. And I think it's also around the way we allocate capital to ensure that we constantly, moving capital towards these type of positive impact activities. And we are seeing some investors also start to step away from your more carbon intensive industries. So it really is about being forward looking. It's finding every lever that we can, because climate change is real. The science is there, it is proven. And the reality is the value that's at risk if we don't move forward is a lot more. And I think that's also getting quite more sophisticated in terms of being able to quantify that value. We're also seeing now actuarial assumptions from the insurance industry starting to factor in climate change a lot more. And as the space evolves, I think you'll find that there's a lot more reason to move rather than stand still.
That's great. I think that's a wonderful point on which to announce our first poll, which is, if you wouldn't mind, Nombulelo, to put that up. It's asking you as the audience whether you agree or not that the South African power sector will in fact undergo unprecedented change in the next 5 years. Now, we've been really sneaky because there is no maybe, so it's a yes/no question. So maybe just, this is there are 140 people on this call. It's a quick snapshot of what the industry thinks in a way. The South African power sector will undergo unprecedented changes in the next 5 years. Yes or no? We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Hold on a second. How are we doing, Nominella? Have we got a fair number of responses or not?
We have about 74% who have engaged.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, it's a click of a button, so hopefully it's doable.
Well, it's
You're
leveled
welcome.
out. I think I'll end it.
Cool. If you wouldn't mind to bring up the results, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, so do they have a drum roll feature on Zoom? I don't think so. Let's see what. Oh, okay. Wow. All right. So effectively 90% of people in the room think that there will be unprecedented change in the next 5 years, which is quite short term in a way, if we think about it. I guess we are also preaching to the converted in a way here, but I also think that, I mean, many of us have been in the sector long enough to remember, well, I remember working on the initial feed-in tariff with NERSA. Then we had the renewable energy bidding program, and we all thought it was going to be, well, I certainly thought it was going to be quite plain sailing after the first REAP was such a success. And then we obviously hit quite a significant disjuncture and stop-start issue. But I tend to agree with the audience, if I may express my personal opinion. I think, one, obviously, the resources we've mentioned are so available, but I also think that famous phrase of never waste a good crisis, I think the unprecedented challenges we're facing around decommissioning of stations that are old, coal-fired power stations that are old, there's too much opportunity. The economics of renewable energy makes too much sense. And I think the way we've seen Eskom and others now driving this conversation towards renewable energy, I think for me is a strong harbinger of what's to come. As I mentioned, the announcement, Eskom signing up renewables, etc. So it seems as if the economics and the finance of it, and even the technical side of it, is going to lead us there. So thank you very much, everybody, for that input. Okay, so I'm going to come now to Pranisha. I mean, your thoughts on what we need to do to unlock this future. Given it looks like we think this is going to happen based on our polling, what do we need to do from your perspective?
From my perspective, I do think there are a few key items. I think number one is the urgent upgrade of the transmission and distribution infrastructure, which you've spoken extensively about. I think number two, funding institutions need to continue to speak to their clients regularly and just guide them in the process in terms of, what is it that you're seeking to do? Do you want to procure on balance sheet funding? Do you want to procure off balance sheet funding? And just kind of advising on the advantages and disadvantages of both. I mean, on balance sheet funding, for example, can be a lot quicker to implement, but I guess your funding tenors would be limited to your typical kind of funding tenors that you would look to for corporates. Whereas off balance sheet funding would maybe lead to longer tenors, thereby reducing your tariff. So it's this little nuances that I think funding institutions can play a key role in advising clients on. I think lastly, from my perspective, what would also be a key unlock is trying to understand the municipal wheeling framework a lot better. I think we do understand or have a pretty good grasp of the Eskom wheeling framework, but there is some work to be done from a municipal perspective, because each municipality differs vastly in terms of the wheeling framework, which is something that we at RMB are trying to upskill on, and just try and understand better so that we can advise our clients better.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Rachel Mitzi, I mean, from your perspective, what do we need to do to unlock this next phase of renewable energy development?
Yeah, I think for me, something that would be key and is an important signal to the market is perhaps to share kind of a vision of the type of market that we'd like to see South Africa, what that power landscape is, just recognizing all of the different stakeholders that have been mentioned, from municipalities, from individual homeowners, from your commercial and industrial sector. So there are a whole range of actors who can contribute to really rolling up renewables, and they have kind of different time horizons. So there's some immediate opportunities that are sitting, I think, from that embedded generation space, some of the initiatives launched by Eskom. So what's happening, but there's also this longer term focus that needs to be enabled. And I do think that being able to demonstrate that we have a degree of clarity around what we want as a country will continue to stimulate more investment, and perhaps in more of those public goods, perhaps the grid in particular. We know that JET-P conversation is taking place, and that was spurred on, I think, to a large degree by being able to demonstrate that we're proactive in planning, in seeking those solutions. So for me, that would be a big way of just empowering a whole range of stakeholders who've already expressed interest, where there's a great deal of desire to participate, to be able to do so, and give clarity and really open up the space. So that would be one of my big, I think, kind of desires or asks going forward.
And maybe if I could ask you, I mean, what is what is the NBI doing in this? If I can give us a chance to obviously talk about what we were planning.
Yes.
I mean, obviously it's a key focus area for the NBI as a whole.
Yeah, thanks for giving me that opportunity, Alex. So one of the initiatives that we have been working on, and this really does demonstrate the degree to which the private sector has been active in, I think, shaping the conversation around renewables. We have an initiative called the Raise Hub, and that's really about raising the ambition for the procurement of renewable electricity in South Africa, and demonstrating the degree to which the corporate sector in particular is quite active in this space. The previous panelists mentioned raising awareness, speaking to clients. So there's a component around that, around understanding what the most immediate opportunities are for corporates in particular to be able to access renewable energy, to be able to procure and to be active in the space. And then there's also components around, how do we stimulate the conversations? How do we build that enabling environment that will get everybody participating in what is such a fantastic opportunity for the country? And then finally, the third objective, also looking at how we then interface, work with all of these emerging kind of opportunities from your traders, from procurement of certificates. How do we actually bring the demand side as well as the supply side together in the space, and ultimately get the scale of renewables that we want to see in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, maybe just also as an aside, I mean, the NBI actually has quite a strong skills development program, and we've actually seen that because they look at where future demand is going, they're looking at the renewable energy sector saying there's going to be future skills needs there. So actually we've done a lot merging the work around how do we actually train young people to work in the renewable energy sector. So it's a really nice synergy with the work the environment team is doing and the skills team as well.
So sorry, Alex, there's a very important point that you raised, and I'd seen in one of the comments, I think it was from Richard, around also understanding the social context of the power system and what the developing power landscape really means for the country. So I think it's a really important point that you raise, and very happy that the NBI is looking at that particular aspect as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably can't avoid this thing. I mean, this has been quite a finance, obviously, focused discussion, but clearly there's the question of the just transition is deeply embedded in this conversation. I mean, Rachel, I mean, what are your thoughts on, how we maybe, for example, prioritize renewable energy investment in provinces like Mpumalanga to try and deal with some of these socioeconomic issues? Any thoughts on that?
So I mean, as part of the work that we did, and that just transition framing was quite an important part, acknowledging that there are a number of different dimensions that need to be dealt with in order for the transition to actually be, to be just. So in Mpumalanga, looking at what does this mean for communities around reskilling, around some of the other opportunities, even to participate in the renewable space as well, are all of the things that one could be looking at to make sure that locality that is so hard hit by some of these changes is being brought into, I think, an evolving economy and some of those evolving opportunities. So I think the framework for us has helped to guide the conversations that we're having with different kind of companies that we're working with, but other stakeholders, is how we play a more active role in addressing this bigger conversation beyond kind of the techno-economic, but looking at the skills, bringing in the financial sector as well into some of the other opportunities that are sitting there around economic diversification, but also inclusion in what is such a great opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly feels like something that has to occur in terms of the power sector, but we still need a whole society approach to also manage some of the other repercussions, I guess, of the shift, as we all know. I was just looking through the chat as well. I mean, Gina, obviously, long time in the energy sector. Your comment around going back to the transmission network, I thought was very interesting. That actually, it's probably more about the approvals process, or as much a constraint or more of an issue on upgrading the transmission network is about, very practical stuff, accessing the land, doing the environmental authorization, people not wanting to provide access for certain servitudes. So thank you for that reminder that actually a lot of this is the timing. Well, first it's the scale of transmission network that we need, and the practicalities from a utility perspective of accessing that land and getting approvals to upgrade the network. So thank you for that reminder as well. Just quickly, I think a sort of a final round of questions before we do our final poll is to sort of come to a point that Rachel Metzi also made, and was Pranisha, you also mentioned this as well, about corporate sort of scale efforts in this, and particularly sort of like, large scale projects. We've heard of, for example, big mining companies saying, we're going to do 5 gigawatts of renewable energy. Like significant numbers that are being thought about, and discussions that were mentioned about PPAs being signed as well. I mean, maybe Pranisha, from your side, do you see growth or potential growth in the corporate South Africa coming to the party on renewable energy? And I guess here I'm not just thinking about a solar rooftop, which obviously is very useful, but I'm thinking that kind of large scale, almost, like I say, utility level scale investment. Do you think that's feasible? Do you think it will happen in our country?
I mean, definitely, we are executing on a number of projects as it stands in the C&I space, mostly for mining clients. So we definitely have seen that uptick from about, I would say, early on this year. We are speaking to clients on the slightly smaller scale, so maybe not the mining clients, but are definitely interested and are trying to gain assistance with, well, who should we be talking to? I think, partnering with very reputable IPPs is critical in an environment like this. So I definitely think there is the interest for corporates to go either partially or fully off-grid. But my sense is that they are currently embarking on the process in terms of, just information gathering. What is my load profile? What technology should I be choosing? Is it wind? Is it solar? Is it battery? Is it a combination of everything? So we really are chatting to our clients on a daily basis to try and, pair them up with those IPPs or offer them the support that they need in embarking on their renewable energy goals.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities you mentioned. Arvana, are you sensing the same thing from your side, or the corporate sector, the corporate investment space? Do you see that as also a growing area?
Yes, indeed. I think, one of the major transactions that we concluded earlier this year was for Harmony Gold, with Harmony Gold, where we raised a 10 billion Rand sustainable finance debt package, and 1.5 billion of that was really to finance phase 2 of their solar PV projects, which will be used to finance the, effectively the procurement of electricity for the operations. Now, the mining space are huge users of energy and water in this country, and in order to keep them in sustainable in operations, it is really important that they transition. And as long as you have big users, which is corporate South Africa, of electricity and water, I think it becomes a massive input cost to run your business, and therefore you've got to start looking at alternatives in terms of being able to secure that energy supply and keep it affordable, to avoid these inflationary increases that are coming through from Eskom as well.
Fantastic, thank you so much. There's some really good questions in the chat, and obviously if any of the panelists would like to actually take a look at or answer any of them, I'll give you guys a chance. Maybe have a flip through, and you can always let me know if there's any ones you would like to specifically address. But while giving our panelists a chance to think about that and digest some of the comments in the chat, we're going to do our final poll, which I think we've clearly primed you for, and I think probably in a subjective way. But our final poll talks to this issue about corporate advancement in renewable energy, and specifically, the extent to which we think corporate South Africa is really going to invest heavily in renewable energy. And I guess, as I say, beyond maybe even just the sort of solar rooftop sort of example, but to sort of a utility scale power generation. So I guess, 1 gigawatt and above in the next 5 years. Again, sorry, there's no maybe, there's a yes, no question. And maybe you give us your thoughts on that. And then I'll hand over to Pranisha and Ivana and Rachel Mitzi for any closing thoughts, in which you also be welcome to answer any of the very interesting comments in the chat as well. So we'll just give you guys a few moments. How are we doing, Nomalila? Are we going to make 75%?
We're at 68%. Let's see.
Okay, that's not so bad. We might get to 70.
We just got to 70.
Brilliant. Are we plateauing at this point?
Let's see. Yeah, I'll stop it now.
Okay, sure.
I'll end
Thank
the
you.
poll.
Okay, so again, in fact, even a higher consensus amongst the group. I guess speaking to the opportunity and the need and the sort of investment required to provide energy security. Okay, well, hopefully we didn't. This will not become the basis of a scientific study, so don't to worry. But there seems to be strong consensus in this room, at least, that there will be big changes, and that corporate South Africa will be a big part of this. Yeah, and I mean, I think we're seeing clearly, yeah, there is already investment happening, right? So it's in that sense, we're seeing the change starting to happen already. So there are a number of questions in the chat. I don't want to put people on the spot necessarily, but maybe I'll start with you, Rachel Mitzi. Are there any other questions that have been raised that you'd specifically like to tackle? And of course, members of the audience, as you have already, you're welcome to also respond to some of those questions if you'd like. But Rachel Mitzi, any questions you particularly, or areas you would particularly like to touch on?
Maybe not to pick on a question, but a point that I do think is well made, and I'd be interested in exploring further, perhaps because it resonates a little bit with my thinking. So Nicholas was talking about the fact that, thinking about massive RE infrastructure in remote places was part of the problem. I think it's important to understand that there will be multiple kind of dimensions and approaches to this renewable space. I think it's a huge opportunity that we as a country and different role players need to appreciate fully, what we can bring to the party, their benefits to participating, and also understanding the specific routes that are available or perhaps optimal for different participants. So I found that quite an interesting and an important point, but just to emphasize that it is an opportunity that is open to a whole range of stakeholders. It would be wonderful if we're able to coordinate and, realize the more immediate opportunities that are available as fast as possible, but also be actively planning towards the kind of scale that we do actually need to fully transform our power system, but also to enable those other economies that are sitting and waiting for the renewables infrastructure to be put in place. So that is, I do think it's important to be quite mindful and deliberate about thinking about those opportunities and positioning ourselves well. And as I said earlier on, being able to demonstrate to the range of investors that we want to get on board, that we are actively thinking about this, that we understand where we are sitting, we understand the opportunities and the entry points, and that we're mobilizing ourselves amongst the different stakeholder groups to be able to play that role. So those things are quite key for me. And yeah, hence I'm picking on that particular statement because it does resonate to such a large degree.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, one of the things that I picked up in the chat, I mean, there's obviously great comments, but there were a few around sort of political economy and, sort of stable political will and sort of regulatory framework. I mean, we did see obviously quite a big shift at one stage a few years ago, moving away from the renewables program. Do you think we'll have that kind of political environment that supports renewable energy over the next few years, from your perspective?
Well, I think this is a great start. So some of those big shifts and moves that we've seen thus far are an important starting point and have helped us to kind of also demonstrate the degree of desire, the willingness, to take it forward. I do hope it's sustained. I do also, I'm mindful of perhaps some of the interruptions we've had in the past, but it's certainly a very emphatic start that hopefully the momentum that's garnered from that start, as well as how people are responding, will be large enough to make sure that we continue to move in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at bid window 6, right? I mean, it was doubled effectively in response to load shedding, essentially. That's a sign in its own right, I guess, in some ways. But one thing I think of is that because of load shedding and the urgent need to bring, kilowatt hours onto the grid, renewable energy is obviously is cost effective, but also its lead time is quite short. And it also seems to me like that's something that will always favor renewable energy in this kind of long-standing load shedding environment, which I think we're in, obviously, as we all know. Thanks so much, Rachel Mitzi. Ivana, any final closing thoughts from your side? And you're welcome to obviously have a go at any of the questions that you'd like. If there's any points that struck you maybe as we were chatting.
Thanks, Alex. I was just running through the questions here, and there's quite a few comments. And yeah, I think what's really important is being able to wrap your head around all of these potential possibilities. I think there was a point made earlier that yes, the tech is advancing rapidly. So what you could invest in now, and I think that's been keeping people in a little bit of a puzzle as to, do we wait and see, or do we continue to invest? And I think it's going to be really important to stay ahead of that curve. So it's going beyond your traditional role or your traditional acumen, and actually going and taking a vested interest and staying ahead of the curve, because I think those who do that will be the winners in this situation. I also think that there are a number of market barriers that we still need to remove, and there is a lot of connecting the dots that's going to be needed. So whether we talk about dollar funding versus rand funding, whether we look at training from a technical perspective to actually get development done in a green design, which is actually green. There's a lot of players in the ecosystem that are all working together for this common good, and it's really finding the right partners that can assist you on this journey. And yeah, there's no going back. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Bernicia, any final thoughts from your side, or anything you'd like to respond to?
Sure. I think there was a specific question directed at me regarding IPPs and whether it really is the best solution for corporates. And what I would say to that is that it really depends on the corporate's requirements. So if the corporate doesn't necessarily want to own their facility and just, wants the provision of power at a certain tariff that escalates at a specific amount, and doesn't want to be, bother themselves with any risks associated with delay in construction or the operations and maintenance of the plant, I think that the IPP structure does work very well. Whereas on the other hand, some corporates may elect to own the facility upfront. So, under that scenario, maybe the IPP structure works a little bit less well. So I guess it's just dependent on what that particular corporate is requiring, whether they're happy to enter into long-term power purchase agreements, or whether they would prefer to purchase power on a shorter-term basis. So yeah.
Oh, sorry for interrupting you. I guess also with the IPP model, I mean, presumably they don't actually have to provide any of the capital, right? So the capex is covered by the IPP itself, right? They're just simply having to agree to a certain, I guess, operating cost that they abide by.
Exactly. That actually is a very good point, because it also depends on the corporate's requirements as to their debt carrying capacity on their balance sheet. If they don't necessarily have a lot of debt carrying capacity, then the IPP structure whereby banks fund into a ring-fence project finance SPV does work quite well. And in that way, we can look at extending out debt tenors in order to get the corporate to the lowest possible tariff. So that's just, I mean, I think each kind of solution has its pros and cons, and it's just depending on what the corporate requires. I mean, I will end up by saying that I do think it's a very exciting time. I know we've talked about a lot in terms of what needs to happen. You know, maybe certain items are not happening as fast as we would like it to. But I mean, from a personal perspective, I really am excited to see how this plays out over the next, 10 or so years. I really think it is a good sector to be involved in.
Great. Thank you so much, Raisha. So I think, there's been a huge wealth of information in the chat, and clearly there's some serious experts on this call. I mean, if I just flip through the names, I can see that. If there are any very specific questions you'd like to raise, you're welcome to. But I think now is probably a good time to give our panelists a chance for a break, and they've been chatting for some time now. So I'd just like to really, really thank Avana Singh, Rachel Mitsi-Molisani for coming and joining us, quite late in the day, and Pranisha Sayadeo for their really excellent insights. I think a lot of useful information, stuff that I wasn't aware of, and so I think some really important conversations we've had. So I hope I'm not going to leave you with too much disappointment, but I think that we should probably close at this point in time. I just want to remind you again that the electricity report completed under the Climate and Sustainable Investment Project is available on the Sustainable Finance webpage. You would have seen a whole bunch of links shared around opinion pieces, additional studies that have been done. And of course, people are available to comment and chat more about these particular issues. Hopefully it's the start of a brave new world, and in a really positive sense, and that we have the sort of stable environment that we need. I think if we focus on just providing a basic enabling environment, the investment will flow. We will find ways, I think, if investment is flowing, if energy security is being realized, to also tackle the socioeconomic challenges, which clearly are going to be predominant in this process. But a South Africa without power and without a renewable energy-based system, that will be a lot poorer for it. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I'm very sorry if we haven't managed to address all of your comments. We wish you a fantastic day, and we will share the presentation in case you'd like to have a look at it. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Great day. Ciao.